The studio lights glowed with their usual morning warmth as Robert Downey Jr. walked out onto the View set, greeted by applause that carried a mixture of admiration and familiarity. He waved casually, a small, self-aware grin tugging at his mouth, the kind that suggested he knew exactly what the audience expected of him and was comfortable letting them think they knew him. He took his seat, adjusting his jacket, exchanging friendly hellos with the panel. The energy felt light, celebratory, like a reunion rather than an interview. Whoopi Goldberg leaned toward him with an amused smile, remarking on how strange it must be to still be introduced as if he were new to the room after decades in the spotlight. Robert laughed easily, his voice relaxed as he joked about how time in Hollywood felt both compressed and endless. He spoke about milestones without reverence, brushing past accolades to talk instead about curiosity, how staying interested had mattered more than staying relevant. The audience laughed when he described forgetting which version of himself fans expected to see, the sharp wit, the reformed rebel, the elder statesman. He shrugged it off with practiced ease, acknowledging that public personas had a way of becoming shared property. The conversation flowed smoothly at first. Joy Behar teased him about his ability to reinvent himself, suggesting that few actors had survived so many cultural shifts with their charm intact. Robert responded with mock seriousness, saying charm was just panic wearing a nice jacket. The audience laughed, and even Sunny Hostin cracked a smile. Whoopi watched him closely, nodding, letting the rhythm settle before gently steering the discussion towards something heavier. She mentioned longevity and second chances, her tone conversational but precise. She asked how it felt to be held up as a symbol of redemption in an industry quick to discard and slow to forgive. The question wasn't accusatory, but it wasn't padded either. The laughter faded, Robert's smile softened, then disappeared entirely. He inhaled, resting his hands together in front of him, eyes dropping briefly to the table as if he were organizing thoughts he hadn't planned to share. The pause stretched longer than daytime television usually allowed. A few audience members shifted in their seats. The hosts waited. Robert looked back up, meeting Whoopi's gaze directly, and nodded once. He said it was complicated. He didn't rush the words. He admitted that being called a redemption story made him uncomfortable, not because he disagreed with the idea of growth, but because it simplified a process that was messy and ongoing. He said he was grateful for the chances he'd been given, but gratitude didn't erase the fact that he'd been given more room to fail than many others ever would. The studio was silent now, the kind of silence that felt intentional rather than awkward. Robert continued, explaining that accountability didn't end when applause returned. He said there was a temptation, especially when people framed his past as a triumphal arc, to believe the hardest part was behind him. But he'd learned that self-awareness wasn't a finish line. It was maintenance. He spoke about how easy it was to accept forgiveness without fully understanding its cost, how public grace could sometimes outpace private reckoning. Whoopi leaned back slightly, eyebrows raised, clearly registering the turn the conversation had taken. This wasn't the polished reflection often delivered on talk shows. It felt more like a confession offered without expectation of absolution. Robert said he'd benefited from timing, from resources, from people willing to invest in him when it would have been simpler not to. He acknowledged that others, equally talented, hadn't been afforded the same patience. He didn't name names or situations, but the implication hung in the air. He said he tried to carry that awareness into every room he entered, though he didn't pretend he always succeeded. Sunny Hostin nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. Joy, quieter now, watched him with a seriousness that replaced her earlier humor. The audience listened intently, some faces softened by recognition, others by surprise. Robert spoke about shame, not as something to be escaped, but something that had taught him to slow down. He said in the past he'd used humor as armor, a way to steer conversations away from places that felt dangerous. He admitted that instinct still surfaced, especially under bright lights. He smiled faintly at that, acknowledging the irony of saying it out loud on a live show. But he said he was trying, more and more, to let questions land instead of bouncing them away. Whoopi responded quietly, saying she hadn't expected such a direct answer. Her voice carried respect rather than challenge. She said many guests treated accountability like a talking point rather than a practice. Robert nodded, accepting the observation without deflection. He added that he no longer believed redemption was something you declared about yourself. He said it was something people observed over time, and even then, it remained fragile. He talked about waking up each day aware that reputation could be rebuilt faster than trust, and that trust demanded consistency, not statements. The words settled heavily, but not uncomfortably. They felt earned. The audience began to applaud, not loudly at first, but with a steady rhythm that grew as he finished speaking. Robert seemed almost surprised by it. He tilted his head slightly, as if unsure whether the response was for him or for the sentiment itself. He offered a small nod, appreciative but restrained. Whoopi thanked him for answering honestly, saying it was rare to see someone resist the urge to package their past neatly. Robert replied that neatness had never served him well. He said the mess had taught him more, even when it was painful. The exchange felt intimate despite the cameras, as though the room had collectively leaned closer. As the segment approached its midpoint, the tone had unmistakably changed. The playful banter that opened the show hadn't vanished, but it had been layered with something deeper. Robert sat differently now, less performative, more present. The hosts mirrored that shift, their questions slowing, their reactions more measured. When the show returned from commercial, the atmosphere felt noticeably different, as if the studio itself had taken a breath and decided to listen more carefully. The applause was still there, but it carried a steadier tone, less celebratory and more appreciative. Robert Downey Jr. remained seated in the same spot, yet his posture had subtly shifted. He leaned forward slightly now, forearms resting near the edge of the table, no longer performing ease but inhabiting it. The moment of candor before the break had reset expectations, and everyone in the room seemed aware they were stepping back into something more thoughtful than routine television. Whoopi Goldberg opened the conversation again, her voice calm, grounded, carrying the authority of someone who knew when to push and when to give space. She said she wanted to stay with the idea Robert had raised about responsibility and grace, because it was something viewers often struggled to reconcile. She asked how that awareness showed up in his life now, not just in words, but in choices. The question wasn't sharp, but it was direct. Robert didn't rush to answer. He nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the weight of the question before responding. He said awareness had made him quieter in rooms where he once would have filled the space. He talked about learning when not to speak, when to listen instead, especially in conversations about accountability that weren't centered on him. He admitted that silence had been uncomfortable at first, that he'd spent years believing presence meant performance. Letting go of that instinct, he said, felt like learning a new language. Sonny Hostin leaned in, asking whether that shift had changed how he approached work. Robert smiled faintly, saying it had changed everything. He explained that he now read scripts with different questions in mind. Instead of asking whether a role was clever or entertaining, he asked whether it told the truth about consequence. He said he was less interested in characters who escaped their actions without cost, and more drawn to stories that acknowledged complexity without glamorizing it. Joy Behar attempted to lighten the mood with a small joke about how audiences still loved a redemption arc, even if reality was messier. Her tone was playful, but gentler than earlier. Robert laughed softly, nodding, and said audiences loved hope, but hope didn't have to mean erasure. He said pretending the past disappeared was comforting, but it wasn't honest. The laughter faded into thoughtful murmurs from the crowd. Whoopi returned to something Robert had said earlier about surprise being a privilege. She admitted she'd expected a more polished answer when she first raised the topic, something practiced and reassuring. Instead, she said, he'd given them something unfinished. She asked him why he'd chosen to respond that way, knowing how easily moments like that could be clipped and misunderstood. Robert's expression softened. He said he'd spent years trying to control how moments were received, only to learn that control was an illusion. He said he responded the way he did because he didn't want to protect an image anymore. He wanted to protect the truth, even when it felt incomplete. He said being misunderstood briefly felt better than being dishonest permanently. The audience responded with a quiet wave of applause, the kind that rippled rather than exploded. He talked about mentorship next, unexpectedly. He said he felt a responsibility to be present for people earlier in their careers, not as an example to imitate, but as someone honest about mistakes. He said he no longer believed inspiration came from perfection. He believed it came from transparency. He shared a story about a young actor who'd asked him how to survive public scrutiny, and how he'd resisted giving advice framed as certainty. Instead, he told them uncertainty was unavoidable, but integrity was a daily choice. Sonny nodded, saying vulnerability from people in positions of power mattered because it widened the conversation rather than narrowing it. Robert agreed, adding that power insulated people from consequences if they weren't careful. He said staying aware of that insulation required effort. It required inviting criticism rather than fearing it. Whoopi reflected on how rarely men on television acknowledge benefiting from systems without immediately shifting to self-defense. She said it was refreshing, not because it absolved anything, but because it opened space for honesty. Robert accepted the comment with a small nod, saying he didn't feel brave for saying what he'd said. He said it felt necessary. As the segment continued, the conversation widened beyond him. The panel discussed how public narratives often demanded clean resolutions, especially from celebrities. Robert observed that society loved closure, but growth didn't operate on a schedule. He said he was wary of moments when applause arrived too easily, because it could signal the end of questioning, rather than the beginning. That line drew one of the stronger applause responses of the segment. Joy, thoughtful now, said that television often rewarded certainty over reflection. Robert smiled at that, saying reflection didn't always make for flashy soundbites, but it lasted longer. He said he didn't mind if the moment didn't go viral for the right reasons. He minded if it went viral for the wrong ones. As the time wound down, Whoopi thanked him again, not just for answering the questions, but for staying with them.